In this video, we're going to discuss experimental research. This is the type of research that can allow you to determine cause and effect relationships. We've alluded to experimental research while we've talked about other types of strategies, but now we'll really get into what an experiment is and why it can determine cause and effect relationships. An experiment is a controlled test of a hypothesis in which the researcher manipulates one variable to determine its effect on the other. And while we discuss experiments, these are some of the terms that we will come across. In this video in particular, we'll talk about independent variables, dependent variables, control group, and experimental groups. In an experiment, we have an independent variable and a dependent variable. The experimenter is going to manipulate that independent variable and predicts that independent variable will have an effect on the dependent variable. The dependent variable is something that is measured. It's the participant's behavior. So the independent variable, again, sometimes referred to as the I of V, is the variable that's manipulated. The dependent variable, or the dV, is the variable that's measured. It is predicted to be affected by the independent variable. You also might want to try to remember that the dependent variable with the D depends on that independent variable. Now let's go over an example. If a researcher hypothesized that the mnemonic devices would improve memory recall for a random list of words, then the independent variable would be the mnemonic device that the experimenter offered, and the dependent variable would be the score on the test of words recalled, so the number of words recalled. So the researcher is manipulating the mnemonic device. Maybe one group has a mnemonic device, another group doesn't, and the behavior that's measured is the number of words recalled. Again, the researcher is predicting that the use of the mnemonic device will have an effect on word recall. Experiments also have control groups or conditions and experimental groups or conditions. The control group is a comparison group, a baseline. Control conditions are needed so that you can be sure the behavior you observed in response to your independent variable is not due to some other factor. In most cases, you'll have a control group and an experimental group. The control group does not get the manipulation of the independent variable. The experimental group is the group that gets the manipulation of that independent variable. Let's go back to our example of a mnemonic device. So the control group would be given this list of words. Let's say it's the names of the Great Lakes: Huron, Erie, Ontario, Superior, and Michigan. The experimental group would be given an acronym, HOMES, to help them remember the names of the Great Lakes. So they'd be H is for Huron, O is for Ontario, M is for Michigan, and so on. So the experimental group gets the acronym, the control group does not, and then the researcher would measure the difference in the number of words remembered between the two groups. One problem with experiments is that the expectation of the participant or the experimenter and the desire of the subject to please the experimenter can at times interfere with the results. So the experimenter's expectation can skew the results, or if the participant knows too much, that can alter the behaviors. So experimenter effects are unintended changes in the participant's behavior due to cues from the researcher. Again, due to researchers' expectations, participants' knowledge of the experiment, or simply the placebo effect. So to protect against this, we have ways to control for this that are called single-blind and double-blind studies. In a single-blind study, the participant would not know if they were in the control or the experimental group, while the experimental would still know. An additional method is the double-blind study, where neither the experimenter or the subject knows which group they're in. An easy way to explain the necessity of these methods is drug studies. In clinical trials for a new drug that a pharmaceutical company has made, we know that there is something occurred that is called the placebo effect. So to keep that from occurring, we need to make sure that the participants do not know if they are getting the real drug or a placebo. For example, a sugar pill. Typically, the clinical trial is actually three groups: the group actually getting the drug, the group that is getting the placebo, and the group that is told they are on a waiting list and acting as a true control. So in this setting, the participant doesn't know which group they are in. They don't know if they're getting the true drug or a placebo. Now, to take this one step farther and make it any better, is The experimenter, the person that's measuring the behavior, also doesn't know. And that's kind of the hallmark of clinical trials, to do it double blind, where the participant does not know if they are getting the drug at hand, and the experimenter who's measuring the behavior also doesn't know. So it's a coded system. I actually used this type of coded system for my master's degree, where I had, when I was slicing brains, I had treated my animals. I had a control group and an experimental group, and then I sliced brains, put them on slides, I stained them, I meticulously marked my slides so that I knew which animal that the brain slices had come from. But then when it came time for me to count cells, the lab person, another person in the lab, one of my peers, actually covered that all up with tape and made a code so that then after I was done doing all of the counting and looking at everything I wanted to look at, we then broke that code and analyzed the data accordingly. So when I did my master's degree, I also was doing a double blind study.